In this video, we're going to dip our toes into a very powerful feature of Harmony Premium, and that's the Master Controller. We're going to use it to create really easy to use controls that will make posing our character super easy. First, let's talk about what a Master Controller itself is. If I pull out the Master Controller node and look at its settings, you'll see it's actually just a container to write code. If you're really good at programming, you can make a Master Controller that does just about anything. But that's not what we'll be doing. What we're actually interested in is under Window, Toolbars, Master Controller. Now on this toolbar here, we have Master Controller Wizards. These will let us automatically generate Master Controller nodes and user interfaces that we can use to control our artwork. Let's start with a simple example of making a slider Master Controller. Now when you set up a Master Controller that controls a character, you want that character to be inside a group, and for that group to have a composite in it. The Master Controller will eventually be attached to that composite too. This will let you save your character rig to the library and bring the Master Controller along with it. It will also help prevent conflicts in the programming if you have multiple copies of the same character, because the scripting in the Master Controller will start at whatever composite it's attached to and look upward from there to find the names of the elements that it's trying to control. Before you can make a Master Controller, what you need to do is have a set of keyframes prepared that you'll want to use with your slider. I've got an animation here of this character's eyes opening and closing. Now let me show you how these eyes are set up. The top and bottom eyelids have a line, and then this green fill that's going to serve as a mask. Then each eyelid has two color selectors, one that selects the line color, and the other that selects the mask color. The mask color gets composited together and masks the white of the eye. Then an auto patch from the whites of the eyes gets the eyelid mask subtracted from it in this matte composite. And that is used to mask the pupil. The point of this setup is that we can now just give each eyelid an envelope deformer, and that lets us bend and curve the eyelids however we want to open and close the eye and create expressions. However, working an envelope deformer can be very tedious, and we don't want to have to do this every time the character blinks. So we're going to make a slider that we can use to open and close the eyes. Now, when you make a Master Controller, it's going to be associated with some composite in your project. We'll just use the main composite for the character that's inside the character group. So let's make sure that we note what the name of this composite is. So to define the range of motion that we want the slider to move through, we need to set up keyframes on the timeline. I've got two here, one with the eyes all the way closed, then another with the eyes all the way open. In this case, I just need 2 frames, the start and end state. The slider will be able to interpolate between the two to get all the middle positions. In another case, you might need more in-between keyframes to make sure the animation looks right. Now it's important to note, the only thing I've changed from the rig's default state on these keyframes are the envelope deformers on the eyelids. So that's the only deformation information that's going to be saved by the Master Controller. Then we just select the 2 keyframes and hit the slider button on the Master Controller toolbar. And now our source range is filled in automatically because we selected the frames first. Otherwise you could fill this in by hand. Then there's slider properties here. Invert directions means the slider will start at the last frame we selected and slide its transition to the first frame in the range. Now a vertical slider is going to start with the handle at the bottom, which makes sense for the eyes closed, which was our first keyframe. So we don't want this one inverted. We also don't want horizontal layout. We want the default vertical slider. And we do want to interpolate. If this weren't on, it would basically just flip between the keyframe states that we had selected. Now, if we were just saving a bunch of drawing substitutions for something like a mouth position slider, you might not want to interpolate, but here we definitely do. And now to double check that our Master Controller is going to only control what we want it to, we can use the Monitored Attributes panel over here. This is going to include all the elements in your scene that are part of the selection you made on the timeline. So if I expand the top level, we can see the character group, and if I expand that, we can see all the parts of the character. I'll stretch this out so we can actually read them. Right now it's monitoring every piece of the character because I had the top level group collapsed when I selected the keyframes. But the only things we actually need on this list are those eyelid deformers. What I can do is use this filter button, and this will filter out attributes that don't change over time. Since our eyelids were the only ones with keyframes on them, if I hit this, it's going to reduce the list down to just those eyelid deformers. And if you want to go a level deeper, you can even see the individual points on the deformer. The more you can whittle down the list of monitored attributes, the better your chances of avoiding conflicts with other master controllers. Then we just specify the name for the master controller here. Then we hit create, and here is where we specify the composite the controller should attach to. We want the main character composite. Then it's going to generate a script file. And we just save that in the script directory of our Harmony project folder. Then if we close the wizard window, you can see the slider on our stage and the master controller node attached to the character composite. If you ever lose track of where a master controller node is, you can open the master controller panel, and this keeps track of all the master controllers in the scene. You can use the magnifying glass to find its node in the network, and you can use the Show Controls button to hide and show the slider itself on your stage. You can also use the regular Show and Hide controls buttons on the top of the stage. Now, I don't want the slider directly over the head, so let's attach a peg to the node, and making sure we're not in animation mode, use the peg to move the slider to the side. So now that's its new default position. Now we can turn animation mode back on, and let's be sure to come out to a blank area of the timeline, and we're able to use the slider to move the eyes up and down. If we want to make a blink animation that plays on our timeline, we just need to use the slider to define the starting position. And you can see whenever we use the slider, it sets keyframes on whatever the slider is set to control. Then come out later and use the slider to define the next keyframes, and make sure that the keyframes are set to interpolation mode. And there we've got our blink. So that's how a master controller works. It's basically a tool for setting a keyframe on multiple different elements at the same time in a particular state. Next, let's look at a slightly more complicated example. Here I have a set of keyframes for this head rotating. We'll make a slider for this. To create these positions, I just went into the face and shifted the parts of the face around, and used envelope deformers on each part to reshape them. I made sure not to put keyframes on the deformers on the eyelids because we don't want the head turn slider to conflict with the eyelid slider. It will try to blend the effects of different master controllers, but it's best to limit what a slider affects wherever possible. I'm just going to select that set of keyframes and go to the slider wizard. And we do want it horizontal this time. Then for the monitored attributes, I'm going to filter out everything except just the parts of the head. Then I'll give it a name, create, attach it to the character composite, save the script, and there's the slider. Let's add a peg to that so we can give it a new position. Now if I come out to an empty part of the timeline, we can test if we're able to use both sliders. And it looks like we can. Now, one last thing, in the settings for the master controller, you're able to customize some things about your sliders. On the Attributes tab, you have the options for invert, horizontal, and interpolate, in case you got those wrong when you set it up and want to change them. Then down here you can change the color of both the slider and the handle. Then there's settings for the widget size, which is the size of the slider basically, though you're probably just better off using the peg to resize it, and for the label size. So you can increase that to make it easier to see, or decrease it to keep it out of the way. So that's how you set up sliders. We're going to look at more examples of how to use those when we create our main character later in the course. Next, we'll look at how to set up a different kind of master controller, a grid master controller. We'll do that in the next video. I'll see you there.